Hello there, it's Alan Garrett, and it's time for another episode of Out of the Bags, this time with Green Lantern 1 to 100. And I've always liked to count back, so we'll do just that. We'll start with issue 100. And just a few things about Green Lantern. It started with a cover date of 1960. It ran to issue 89 in the spring summer of 1972, and it was abruptly canceled. It started back up in 1976 with issue 90, and it went to issue 224 in 1988, becoming the Green Lantern Corps back around issue 205, 206. So anyway, we're going to count back, and I've got a story for you. I've talked about the first comic convention I ever went to, which was in 1973. It was a Phil Seuling. Phil Seuling was the grandfather of distribution, or direct distribution, I should say. And these shows were usually held in a rather large hotel in Manhattan. And my father took my friend Bill Marcinko and I back in April 1970. Most of the Phil Seuling shows happen once a month. It's a great way to pick up books, aside from mail order catalogs and things like the Buyer's Guide and comic readers and stuff like that. A little side note here. When they relaunched Green Lantern with issue 90, it was a cover date of 1976. Yeah, I bought 2 copies of it because I was 15. And I was excited because Mike Grell was touted to be the up-and-coming Neil Adams, and I love the artwork. So that's why there's 2 copies of that. Last issue of the Neil Adams series. These are all bought by me off the rack. And yes, I go all the way to 224, but most of those issues, Green Lantern is really a great Silver Age run and Bronze Age run to have because it's relatively inexpensive. Some of the issues can be a little pricier, like this one, and this one, and this one, but still very affordable if you don't mind getting the lower grades, which I don't mind. Some of the ones from the 70s I would mind, but these I don't mind at all. Anyway, so I would go to these conventions with my friend Bill Marcinko and my father, and dealers were very different back then. They didn't have the wall displays. Really didn't have wall books. Everything was just flat out on a table. And back in the early 70s, comic bags were around. Few dealers actually used them. There was no such thing as boxes or backer boards or Mylar. Matter of fact, a good friend of mine, Josh Ed Petrie, who owned Dreamers Comics, told me that he remembered when Mylar started coming out. And Josh, about 8, 9 years older than me, he was dealing at shows back in the late 60s when he was still a teenager. And he said that Mylar could make any book look great. It didn't matter if the book was in poor condition. You put it in a Mylar sleeve, people wanted that book. And so that's another reason I think I like doing the out of the bags, is you get to see the books for what they are. And I always say this, some of the books are really nice, and other the books are well read. But it doesn't really matter. If you've never read this run of Green Lantern, issues 76 to 89, and 88 is a reprint issue, but it's still, the cover makes it worthwhile owning it. If you've never read it, you need to read it. The reprints, whatever, it's a really, really great run of books. And it really did change, I think, Green Lantern and Green Arrow's relationship. And it changed, I think, the way books were written and drawn. Uh-oh, here comes a date stamp. Cougar Comics. Sorry. But anyway, so back to the story. So I would go to these shows as often as I could, and I'd pick up usually quarter boxes, and they would be the oversized Marvel books, most reprints. Probably the first set of books I ever completed were the Marvel Collector's Item Classics, which became Marvel's Greatest Comics with issue 23, Marvel Tales, Fantasy Masterpieces, becoming Marvel Superheroes with issue number 12. And giant-sized books like that, because I love the giant-sized books. I just love them so much. And to me, you felt like you were getting so much for your quarter. And a lot of them were 25-cent cover price. And the idea that you can actually pick up a book for a cover price was just extraordinary. So I picked up a lot of that stuff. Bill was always with me, and he was always saying, why are you wasting your time on reprints? I love the reprints. They weren't really reprints to me because it was how I was learning about early Silver Age Marvel and Golden Age DC. And yes, I was picking up 80-page giants as well. Quick story about this book. I gave this comic to my grandmother on my mother's side, and she asked me if I would take it back, and she would hold on to it. And I insisted that she kept it. And when she died, and my mother cleaned out her house, she had this in a drawer, and so I've always remembered it. Very symbolic about my grandmother, Nana Hingle, Elizabeth Hingle. So anyway, these comic shows were great because they were very, very minimalistic. There are no bags, no boards, no boxes. Just books were basically put on the table, kind of like that, and people would just leaf through them. And yes, I know a lot of the purists are going to say, "Oh my God, the damage," and I'm sure there was some. Oh, by the way, here issue 63 is the first Neil Adams cover. A lot of folks think about just 76 through 89, but Neil Adams did issue 63, and you can tell that's a Neil Adams cover. This is after comics out of the bags. Scattered stories about comic book shows. Love the Golden Age crossovers that Green Lantern, The Flash, and JLA did. And occasionally the Atom. No Golden Age crossovers with Superman, though. Nope, they couldn't explain that. Start going through this a little bit quicker because I realize this is taking some time. Anyway, back to the story. So I went to a lot of comic shows when I was 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. I was finding them in New Jersey and New York, and, most of them were free, Back then, you'd have an occasional artist or writer that would join the fray, and the autographs, of course, were free. Nobody ever charged for an autograph. Who would pay for an autograph? That's very much a thing of the last 30 plus years. But I would go to these shows, and I would get bags full of comics, because I would always bring a paper bag with me, or sometimes a box, and for $7, $8, $9, you'd walk away with a lot of comics that you didn't have before. And it was all about completing things and completing sets and writing out lists. And it was all about the stuff that made comics fun. I've collected comics for 50 years this year, and I never stopped. There might have been a couple of months where I slowed down. I bought new comics from Christmas of 1970 all the way till about 2003. Just about every week, if not every week, then every month. And around 2003, I started losing my interest for new comics. And since eBay had been available for years, most of my interest was in completing sets and runs and all that, and not newer comics, which by that point I was thinking were becoming very, very expensive. And they were. I still believe to this day that comics do not need to be $4 a piece. Not for an average comic. It's ridiculous. Anyway, I digress. Some of my favorite shows were in Wayne, New Jersey. If you're familiar, they do a monthly show there that's just spectacular. Love the Wayne, New Jersey shows. We'll make another pile. Push that over there. The date stamp. It's funny when you start looking for date stamps in your collection and you realize that you've got a lot more than you ever thought you had. It's interesting too when you start looking through your books and you start finding either flaws or interesting things that you had forgotten about, even if you had made notations. But I'd collect comics starting in December of 1970 all the way to 2003. And there was nothing quite like the thrill of going to the store and seeing a whole stack of books bundled up and knowing how you can unbundle it with your trusty pocket knife from Boy Scouts, and then knowing that they were going to ask you to not come back, and that would last for about a month, and they'd get a new employee and they'd forget, and you'd go and do it again. Wasn't stealing anything, I was just rescuing the books. These books that have the 9 pence mark on them, they're basically U.S. editions, they just a little pence mark was put on them. I got from a collector from England back when eBay just started forming around 96, 97. And he had a bundle of these books, and I think I ended up getting them for $1.50 a piece. All of them in relatively really nice condition too. And he just wanted to get rid of his collection. It's interesting. The reason I've been able to hold on to my collection for so many years is because I never put a value on it. I think once you start looking at your books like they're worth money, you start thinking about it as, well, it could rescue me if I get into a bad situation. If you look at your comics, like you look at your shell collection or rock collection or stuff like that, which basically can be relatively worthless, then you're never tempted to really go, oh, well, I've got these, I could always sell these. Plus, one of the worst things you can do is to tell folks, yeah, I've got a lot of comics and they're worth a lot of money. I think sometimes we do that anyway with our wives to justify spending a lot of money on comics, but I've never looked at comics as monetary things. They're collectibles to me, they're fun. Yes, I'm not an idiot. I mean, well, depends on who you talk to. I know that books have value. I know they have worth. I know you need to take care of them. But I never think of them as something that I could put in the bank. Yes, I've sold 3 different times books that I didn't want to sell. First time was the X-Men. I've told that story because I had crashed my car after I graduated college and I needed money to repair it. That was a desperate move back in 1982, but as soon as I sold it, I started buying them back. Bought them back really quick. The next time was in the 90s when I sold a set of Hulk 1 through 6. And yes, as soon as I sold that, I started buying that back. And that was not a necessary sell, but somebody had offered me a large amount of money for that set, which I thought was ridiculous. And now it wouldn't be ridiculous, but I bought that set back. The only thing I've ever sold that I've never bought back was Brave and the Bold 28. And when they announced the movie for the Justice League of America, and the price on that skyrocketed years ago. I guess it was probably 4 years ago, 5 years ago. The movie didn't do well. The books dropped, but not before I sold it for a very large amount and paid for my son's final year of college, final semester of college. And I didn't get it back. And so shame on me, but most of the time I really try not to look at them as things of value. And you know what? If you do, it's no big deal, but I try not to think about it like that, because inevitably if you do, you're going to sell it. Yeah, we get desperate times and you might have to, and I'm not telling you what to do. I'm just saying don't always think about it as monetary and worth money, because that's when you get into trouble. All right, final 4 issues of the Green Lantern. This is Alan Garrett with After Comics Out of the Bags as we look at the Green Lantern. Love the series. It's a pretty easy series to put together. especially after that movie flopped. This was a real nice issue of one. The other thing that I wanted to mention was patience, because I was looking for a Green Lantern one for years, and a few years ago I came across one. And you sometimes it takes hundreds of auctions, hundreds of stores or shows before you find one that matches the condition and the price that you're willing to pay. And it's worth the wait. Hey, thanks for letting me tell some stories, kind of scattered as they were. I've always loved going to comic shows. I've always loved going to comic stores. I've always loved mail ordering. And I just love collecting in general. I'm Alan Garrett. Thanks for watching.